Hi there, my name is Sara Ford and I'm with Education Minnesota in the Policy Research and Outreach Division. And I work with the Minnesota Board of Teaching. I'm Education Minnesota's liaison to the Board of Teaching, our staff liaison, and we'll be working with the new Professional Educator Licensing and Standards Board that's coming in. And I'm here today to talk to you about a couple things, to do an overview of the sweeping changes that were made to Minnesota's licensing system in the last legislative session, to talk about the transition into that, what the transition timeline will look like for that new licensing system, as well as to provide an overview of the change in governance over the licensing system from the Board of Teaching and the Minnesota Department of Education's licensing division to a brand new entity that will be handling all of licensing. So I'm going to go over all of that one piece at a time. First of all, how we got here, we have the last couple of years in the legislature and outside the legislature with a lot of stakeholders, there have been many conversations about frustrations with the overlap or a lack of clarity around the distinction between what parts of licensing are handled by the Minnesota Department of Education's licensing division and what what pieces of licensing are handled by the Board of Teaching. They are two separate entities. There are some folks who feel that customer service has sort of been lost in the middle, sometimes some confusion about which entity is accountable or responsible for which questions, and folks not always knowing who to call. We also have accumulated a lot of legislative changes over the years, legislative changes to licensing statutes that have resulted in a lot of Band-Aid quick fixes or special interest fixes so that the law is a patchwork, or was until this last session, a patchwork that was at the end of the day not in itself coherent. In fact, we use some of the same terms around licensing to mean two different things in some parts of the law. So the legislature commissioned the Office of the Legislative Auditor to do an audit of the licensing system, and that auditor's report came back with one very strong recommendation, which was to combine all of licensing under one entity. It also came back with a recommendation to streamline the licensing system, the number and types of licenses that are available, and make it much clearer how one gets there and what those requirements are. And so out of that came this legislative session. We were about to move into a new tiered licensing system. We're also going to move to a new governing body, and I'm going to walk through those pieces as we go. Just a note as we go through these, there are a lot of questions members have about what this will look like that are not yet answered or answerable, because the current Board of Teaching and the upcoming PELSBA, the new board, have to make rules determining how all of these changes are going to take effect. So we're very engaged in the rulemaking process. I'll let you know as we go through the presentation where some of the rulemaking battles, if you were, are taking place, what some of the concerns are around some of the rules that are yet to be written. But know that how all of this happens is not entirely set in stone, because the rulemaking process will take up all the way up until July 1st of 2018. And we'll keep you posted at Education Minnesota as that moves along. So for this current academic year, the 2017-2018 academic year, licensing will remain as it has been. That is to say, teachers coming out of teacher preparation programs or moving here from another state will apply to MDE's licensing division for their licenses. Districts will apply to the Board of Teaching if they're seeking exceptions to the rules, for example, or if they're seeking non-licensed community expert status for a particular person they want to hire, that kind of thing. Everything will stay the same. So this year we will still have non-licensed community experts in our classrooms. That number of those has gone up slightly every year for the past 10 or more years. Last year we had roughly between 1,000 and 1,200 of those in our classrooms. We have no reason to expect that wouldn't be slightly higher, but also no reason to expect it would be grossly higher this year. So that will look a lot very familiar to folks. There will still be teachers with 5-year standard license teaching on variances, still have limited license. It will be the same system. But what happens is, starting July 1 of 2018, so starting next summer, we will move into this new tiered licensure system. And the only licenses, the only folks that will be teaching in our public and charter schools in Minnesota will be Tier 1 teachers, Tier 2 licensed teachers. These are all licenses. Tier 1 license, a Tier 2 license, a Tier 3 license, a Tier 4 license, or substitute licensed teachers. There will be a mechanism very much like our current variances. It's likely to not be called a variance anymore. We don't anticipate it being a very different process, and so we don't have, I'm not going to mention that much or go into that in much detail, except to say now there will be something similar to the current variance process, which allows a teacher in one licensure area to teach in a field outside of his or her licensure area. We don't expect that, that's not very concerning. We don't have red flags. We expect that to be fairly smooth. We'll keep you updated as that goes. Okay, so I'm going to walk through the tiers first, Tier 1 through 4, and talk about what they're intended to do and what some of our concerns are around those tiers. So Tier 1, this tier was developed to encapsulate teachers who are currently called non-licensed community experts. These are emergency hires. Every state in the United States has a provision, has a term for folks who don't meet qualifications for other levels of licensures, other levels of teacher licensure, but they're in emergency situations. How does a district hire somebody and what kind of credentials does that person have? And in Minnesota, that has been called a non-licensed community expert. Going forward, that person will be a Tier 1 teacher. So this is a fairly significant change. So Tier 1 teacher takes the place of the non-licensed community expert. Who applies for a Tier 1 license? The district and the applicant need to apply jointly for this license. This is not a license that a candidate can apply directly to the PELSBA for. I can't go to the PELSBA and say, I think I have the qualifications to be a Tier 1 license, and then I want to go find a job. In fact, the district has to post a position, want to hire me, and then jointly they would apply with the district for my Tier 1 license. It is a one-year license. The Tier 1 is a one-year license. It can be renewed up to 3 times for a total of 4 years. There are also many, many exceptions to that cap of 4 years. So that in many cases, a district by law could extend somebody's Tier 1 license indefinitely. Maybe in every case, but certainly in many cases. So here are some of the exceptions. For career and technical education teachers, they can be renewed indefinitely at Tier 1. The district can extend renewals at Tier 1 beyond the 4-year cap if they can show good cause. And good cause is the language that's in statute. And as you can imagine, in rulemaking, that there's quite a robust conversation happening about what good cause is going to be and how districts are going to have to demonstrate that good cause. I'll talk a little bit about what kind of rulemaking language we're looking at for that in a minute. And then the law also permits for unlimited renewals at Tier 1 in areas, in shortage areas. And shortage areas is defined in 2 ways in the statute. One is a very standard definition of a shortage area, and that is every year MDE, working with the federal government, develops a list of licensure areas that in Minnesota are shortage areas where it's particularly difficult to find qualified teachers to teach. That list gets published every year, and so that list, special education is always at the top, and it's the biggest percentage of that list. Science and math are often heavy. So any licensure area that's identified on MDE's list of shortage areas, if you have a Tier 1 teacher in that field, you can indefinitely renew that Tier 1 license. And then the second definition of shortage area is an odd one in the law, and it says, the law says that if the district is in an economic development region in Minnesota wherein the student body is more racially and ethnically diverse than the teaching body, than the teaching workforce, then you can indefinitely renew a Tier 1 teacher. Now, the intent of that law, according to the legislators who put it in there, was to say if that Tier 1 teacher is a person of color and would help close the gap between the diversity, the level of diversity in the teaching ranks and level of diversity in the student ranks. But that language never actually made it there. So if a district is in an economic development region in which the student diversity the student body is more diverse racially and ethnically than the teaching force, then a Tier 1 teacher can be renewed indefinitely. So those are all the exceptions to that cap for Tier 1. A candidate for Tier 1 has to have a bachelor's degree, and this is a change from the non-licensed community expert language. The bachelor's degree was not a requirement there. This is for all fields except career and technical education fields. And the bachelor's degree does not need to be in the content area, and there's no retroactive limit on how recent that bachelor's degree needs to have been acquired. So the person does have to have a bachelor's degree in something. For career and technical education teachers, the requirement to a bachelor's degree isn't there, and that's because for a lot of those fields, let's take welding for example, some of the highest level of welders, some of the people we would most want teaching welding in our schools, may not have ever gone through a bachelor level. They might have gone right from an AA to an apprenticeship program or into the industry in a different way, and it doesn't make sense to hold the bachelor level requirement there. And so for career and technical education faculty, instead of the bachelor's requirement, they need to have either an AA degree or 5 years of relevant work experience or a professional certification of some kind, which will be determined by the board. So the idea is that the board will go to each of those industries, construction trades, welding, things like that, and ask them what professional certification, state level or national level, exists that we should acknowledge for this requirement. So that's how CTE folks are a little bit different. A Tier 1 application, when the district submits this application, it needs to affirm that they think that the individual can meet the needs of the students, has the necessary skills and knowledge to teach in the content area, has to include a background check. And the district at this point, when they're applying for a Tier 1 license, the district must demonstrate that the position was posted and that the district was unable to hire an acceptable 2, 3, or 4 teacher. And that's a statute around which rulemaking is going to be really important, because the degree to which how a district demonstrates that it was unable to hire an acceptable teacher is going to be very, very important. Of course, there are some districts that are already saying, we're going to demonstrate it by checking a box that says we were unable to hire a teacher that we like. We are concerned at Education Minnesota, very concerned about potential abuses of this language. For example, we've seen community expert requests come from districts to the Board of Teaching for positions for which there were 6, 10, and in one case even 33 licensed teachers who applied. And the district simply said, those people were all a bad fit, so we want a community expert waiver for this particular person. We would like to see districts have to show why, in fact, have to show that they couldn't hire a teacher who was licensed at a higher tier, or if there were some folks who applied at a higher tier, that there are legitimate reasons why they aren't being hired, and instead they're seeking a Tier 1 license. So rulemaking to come, we'll keep you updated. The law also says Tier 1 teachers need to participate in mentorship and evaluation. We're not sure how that's going to play out, because the statute also says for Tier 1 teachers that they need to participate in TD and E only to the extent practicable. So we're not entirely sure how that's going to play out. What does it mean to say a teacher needs to participate in mentorship and evaluation, but not necessarily in TDE? And so we are continuing to work with PELSBA and other stakeholders to help do what we can to help shape that and make that meaningful. Tier 1 teachers, importantly, are not in the teachers' bargaining unit. So this marks the first time in Minnesota where we will have a group of licensed teachers who are not in the teachers' bargaining unit. Tier 1 licenses are limited to the district or charter school that made the application, so you can't become a Tier 1 teacher in one district and then say, I'm now Tier 1 and get a job in a different district with that license. They're limited to the district or charter school that made the application, and of course to the subject matter listed on the license. Tier 1 teachers are not covered by continuing contract law. They are not considered probationary. Their service does not count toward a probationary period, even should they eventually become probationary teachers. When they reach higher levels of tiers, their service at Tier 1 will not count toward the probationary requirement. So that's Tier 1. I'm going to move on to Tier 2. And I will point backwards a couple times to talk about the various ways people might move through these tiers. So Tier 2 was, I think a lot of the people who designed this were thinking, for the most part, of people who are in our classrooms already with teaching assignments, but who have not yet finished teacher preparation. They're enrolled in teacher preparation. Some of our Grow Your Own programs designed for paraprofessionals, who are already in teaching assignments, but as of right now are not yet at a full 5-year standard license. But have teaching assignments or in teacher prep. So this is Tier 2. This again is a license that is not mobile. This is again a license just like Tier 1 that the district and the candidate must apply for jointly. You can't go directly to PELSBA and say, I think I'm a qualified Tier 2 teacher. The district has to want to hire you and then start the process. This Tier 2 license is good for 2 years, and it can be renewed up to 3 times for a total of 8 years. In addition to those 8 years, the statute says that the new board must write rules defining circumstances under which districts could request even more years beyond those 8. So right now there's a cap of 8, but we know there are going to be some circumstances that we know the legislature was saying you have to make room for some special circumstances in which a district would need to request more years. I don't know what those are going to be yet, but we will keep you posted. So a Tier 2 teacher, again, a bachelor's degree unless it's a career and tech ed faculty member, and in that case I've already talked about the requirements for that. So same as the Tier 1, and they have to meet one of the following criteria. A Tier 2 applicant must either be enrolled in a Minnesota approved teacher prep program, hold a master's degree in a teaching assignment in the teaching assignment content area. So that's quite a jump from the Tier 1. Instead of having a bachelor's degree in something, if I'm got a math assignment, I need to hold and have a master's degree in my teaching assignment area. Again, that not necessarily teacher prep. That's one way to get to Tier 2. Or have 2 of the following, and this list is going to cause some, often causes some raised eyebrows, because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I'll walk through it. So you need to, again, this says you have to have one of 3. You have to be enrolled in a teacher prep program, or have a master's degree in your content area, or have 2 of the following. 8 upper division credits in the content field that you're teaching in. A field-specific methods class, so 1 methods class. 2 or more years teaching in the content field. Passing scores on content and pedagogy. And the last item on the list where you need to have 2 of these is completed a state-approved teacher preparation program. So again, the biggest group of people we hope land in Tier 2 are folks that are already teaching but who are enrolled in a teacher prep program. But you'll note that if you look at C on that bottom list, I do want to point out the sort of the minimum requirements to move through the tiers, which we hope isn't how most people are moving through the tiers, but the minimum requirements for moving through the tiers in Minnesota's new licensure system are lower than we've ever seen, and so I want to make sure that it's clear what those are. In this case, you can get to Tier 2 by doing the very minimum amount, not by being enrolled in teacher prep, not by having a master's degree in your content field, but by simply taking 1 methods class and having completed 2 years at Tier 1. And again, you could have been at Tier 1 for several years. You can stay at Tier 2 for several years. So these folks could, at a very minimum, have just a single methods class and a couple years behind them teaching in the content field. No teacher preparation at all. So I'm going to keep moving. A Tier 2 application needs to show that needs to include a background check. It also, the law also says Tier 2 folks need to participate in mentorship and evaluation, but again, there is that caveat language in the statute that says they must participate in teacher development and evaluation to the extent practicable. So on the one hand, they need to participate in mentorship and evaluation. On the other hand, actually being in TDE is at the district's discretion to the extent practicable, and we're still working on what that means and what that will look like. Tier 2 teachers are in the teachers bargaining unit. That's a really critical point. Their licenses are just like Tier 1 licenses. Tier 1 licenses are limited to the district or charter school that made the application. These are not mobile licenses, and to the subject matter listed on the license. Tier 2 teachers are not covered by continuing contract law, and their service is not considered probationary. These are not probationary teachers. However, should Tier 2 teachers move to Tier 3 or 4 and become probationary teachers, they can use up to 2 consecutive years at Tier 2 toward that eventual probationary requirement. So they can use 2 years toward an eventual probationary requirement, but while they're at Tier 2, for however long they're at Tier 2, they are not probationary teachers. Okay, so I'm going to move on to Tier 3. Tier 3 is largely envisioned as the tier into which people coming right out of teacher preparation programs would go. It's also the tier into which many, many teachers who come from other states would go, depending on their credentials, but it's where a lot of those would land. This is the first full professional license in that it can be renewed indefinitely, and it is mobile throughout the state. So this is the first license that a candidate, this is the first license as we move up in the numbers, where a candidate applies directly to the PELSBA for their statewide Tier 3 license. You don't need a district to want to hire you to apply for that license. You apply and get your license on your own. It is good for 3 years, but it can be renewed indefinitely. So there will be a pool of folks who get to Tier 3 and stay at Tier 3. I'll talk about that a little bit when we get to Tier 4 about why some folks might not move on to Tier 4. So it's first full professional license. So Tier 3 requirements. Again, I'm going to hit that second bullet point first. Again, a bachelor's degree for everybody unless it's a career and tech ed teacher, and the requirements are the same there. For Tier 3, you have to have passed content and pedagogy exams. So you remember when we talked about Tier 2, one of the ways to get to Tier 2 was to have 2 of those pieces on the bottom bullet list, like one methods class, and one of those bullets was actually completed a teacher prep program. And you might say, why would someone who's completed a teacher prep program be at Tier 2? And the only reason I can think of that someone who's completed a teacher prep program would still be at Tier 2 is if they haven't passed content and pedagogy exams yet, because that is a requirement for Tier 3. So they have, and then they have to do one of the following. So they've completed content and pedagogy, and they have their bachelor's degree unless they're in CTE. And then one of the following. They've completed a Minnesota approved teacher preparation program, or they've completed a teacher preparation program that's approved in another state that has a field-specific teaching experience, a field-specific student teaching experience that is akin to Minnesota's, so a program that is as robust as Minnesota's, or they have a license via portfolio, and then these last 2 pieces are where things change. It's a seismic shift for licensing for the profession in Minnesota, these last 2 pieces. Or you can get to Tier 3 if you haven't been to a teacher preparation program either in Minnesota or a similar program elsewhere, and you haven't gotten a license via portfolio. You can get there by having 3 years of teaching experience at Tier 2 without having been placed on an improvement plan. And this is where, so I want to point out again, while we hope that most people moving through the tiers are moving through the tiers in order to garner the preparation necessary to meet student needs, there is a way to get to Tier 3 that avoids teacher preparation altogether. Remember, you can be Tier 1 if you have a bachelor's degree in anything. You can be Tier 2 if you've taken one methods class and survived a couple years at Tier 1. You can become Tier 3 if you pass content and pedagogy, never had any teacher preparation experience, as long as you have 3 years teaching at Tier 2 without having been put on an improvement plan. So that's a seismic shift, and that's the moment, this is the moment in the 2017 legislative session when, as one of our staff people here so well put it, teaching in Minnesota became a preparational optional endeavor. And then the last piece is, the last item on that list, E, is or a professional teaching license from another state and evidence that the candidate's license is in good standing and 2 years teaching experience. So those are the various ways you can get to Tier 3. Tier 3 teachers are in our teachers bargaining unit. They are not limited, as I said, to any specific district or charter school. They are mobile. Tier 3 licenses are, as all licenses are, limited to the subject matter listed on the license. These Tier 3 teachers are covered by continuing contract law, and they are eligible for continuing contract status after probationary period. And as I mentioned before, if a teacher reaches Tier 3 via Tier 2, that teacher can count up to 2 years of successful teaching at Tier 2 toward his or her 3-year probationary period. Tier 3 teachers are required to participate in evaluation and mentoring. So then I'm going to move to Tier 4. Tier 4 teachers also apply directly to PELSBA for their license. This, again, is a full professional license. It's mobile. You can take it throughout the state. And it is not limited to the district or charter school where you first worked. A Tier 4 license is good for 5 years. It can be renewed indefinitely. So Tier 3 is good for 3 years. Tier 4 is good for 5. A Tier 4 license, that candidates for Tier 4 license must meet all of the requirements of Tier 3. So remember, they've passed content and pedagogy. Plus, they have to have passing scores on the basic skills test or a board-approved alternative. That basic skills test right now is the NES. It's a Pearson measurement. The board has also approved several other tests that can be used, Praxis, GRE, and ACT, and SAT, that can be used as another way to meet that requirement. But to get to Tier 4, candidates must have passing scores on either the basic skills test or a board-approved alternative to the basic skills test. To get to Tier 4, a teacher must have 3 years teaching experience in Minnesota. And to get to Tier 4, the teacher's most recent summative evaluation must not have placed him or her on an improvement plan. This was an enormous fight at the during the legislative session. It has been our position all along that the licensing process should have nothing to do with the evaluation process, that those two are separate. It's akin to, mixing them is akin to saying, if I'm an attorney and I work at a law firm and it's not a good fit and I leave, I don't, because of that movement, I don't lose my teaching license or lose my license to practice law in the state of Minnesota. I simply move someplace else. But some of the legislation here was very interested in inserting teacher evaluation into the licensing statutes, and this is where it landed. So to get to Tier 4, to be eligible initially for Tier 4, a teacher's most recent summative evaluation must not have placed him or her on an improvement plan. So all those things must be there, and then one of the following: completion of a Minnesota approved teacher preparation program or completion of a teacher preparation program from another state if it includes a field-specific student teaching experience equivalent to Minnesota. So to get to Tier 4, you have to have a completed teacher prep. You also have to have passed the basic skills requirement. You have to have 3 years teaching experience, and your most recent summative evaluation must not have placed you on an improvement plan. Those are all initial eligibility requirements for Tier 4. Also with Tier 4, they are in our bargaining unit. Their licenses are not, again, limited to the specific charter or district that hired them. Those licenses remain limited to the subject matter listed on the license. These people are covered by continuing contract law and are eligible for continuing contract after completing the applicable probationary period. Tier 4 teachers are required to participate in evaluation and mentoring. And I should note, if a person's coming from teacher preparation and moves into Tier 3 for 3 years and then moves to Tier 4, because then they'll have 3 years teaching experience in Minnesota, their probationary period will already be completed. So a lot of folks in Tier 4 won't be probationary, but it's possible. So you should just note that. So here's an important note, and a lot of teachers get anxious. A lot of our current members get anxious about this, and I want to be as clear as I can. All of our current 5-year standard license holders are automatically grandfathered in to Tier 4 status. So those initial eligibility requirements that I just listed, including the most recent summative evaluation not having put the person on an improvement plan, those will be for people coming into the system newly after July 1 of 2018. All current 5-year standard license holders will be automatically transitioned to a Tier 4 license, and I will talk about the timeline for that transition in just a minute. So those eligibility requirements are not applicable to our current 5-year standard license holders. Those folks will be Tier 4 teachers automatically. It's just a matter of the timeline and the IT system and when exactly that shift happens, and I'll go over what we think is going to happen in a minute. So here's what the transition is going to look like. Now, I'm not going to go into the details and the weeds about transition timelines for every type of license because there are many and we get too deep into the weeds. but I'm the person to call if you've got questions about that, and I do have some details from the current Board of Teaching about how they envision their limited licenses and other types of licenses transitioning. I am though going to talk about standard 5-year professional, standard 5-year license holders and what their timeline looks like. So starting July 1 of 2018, all new applicants for licensure in Minnesota will be placed into the new tiered system. And they will apply not to the Minnesota Department of Education's licensing division, because that will no longer exist. They will apply directly to PELSBA, the Professional Educator Licensing Standards Board. Licensing and Standards Board. So starting July 1, 2018, all new applicants will be put into a tiered system. On January 1 of 18, which is just coming up here, January 1 of 2018, all current 5-year standard licenses will automatically be extended by 1 year. So let's say I'm a high school English teacher and I'm sitting right now on a 5-year standard license and it's due to expire in 2020. On January 1 of 2018, I don't need to do anything. My license will suddenly be extended to 2021. And that will happen across the board to everybody. Whatever your expiration date is, it will be extended 1 year. If even after that 1-year extension, someone has a 5-year standard license that's set to expire before June 30th of 2019, when that teacher applies for relicensure, the new license will be a Tier 4 license. For everybody else, for the vast majority of folks, once they get that 1-year extension, they'll be waiting on this date. On July 1 of 2019, this is the anticipated day that this will change. On July 1 of 2019, the PELSBA will automatically convert all 5-year standard licenses to a Tier 4 license, and those new Tier 4 licenses will have the very same extended expiration date that they had before. So again, if we use my example, let me give you my example on the next slide. If teacher A has a 5-year standard license that currently has an expiration date of 2020, on January 1, 2018, that same license will be given a new expiration date of 2021. And then on July 1, 2019, that license, that 5-year standard license, will automatically convert to a Tier 4 license, and it will have an expiration date that was on the original of extended license of 2021. The reason they do that and don't start everybody over is they don't want to have a 5-year cycle whereby 50,000 teachers all have to renew in the same year. Our local licensing renewal, our local continuing education committees couldn't handle that workload, and neither could the IT system. So people will continue to roll on in a 5-year cycle after that time. I do want to note about this timeline, we will keep you as updated as we can. There's a dedicated spot on our website. If you have our tiered licensure infographic, this purple document, you'll note in the bottom left-hand corner, it links to our website where you can go to find the most recent information on the transition timeline. In case those dates change, we will keep them posted there and alert you that way. So if you're anxious about timelines or interested in them, we're not entirely certain what we've just laid out for you won't change, but we will keep you updated if it does change. Okay, so I'm going to move through questions, and I'm going to move on to just mention licensure renewal. There are some changes in the statute already to licensure, the process of licensure renewal. One of the biggest of those is that the old human relations requirement is gone. In its place is a requirement for training and cultural competency, and that requirement falls at the renewal stage for every tier, Tier 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this is a type of training that folks will have on an ongoing basis. We are working with other stakeholders and the Board of Teaching, and will be working with the PELSBA to determine how that cultural competency training is defined, and our interest is in making sure that it is robust and that it meets the needs of the students and their educators. So that will change, and that was in statute. Another thing that may very well change is the board is considering changing the 125 clock hour requirement that many of you are already familiar with. They are interested in making sure your professional development is robust and meaningful, and they are interested in looking at mechanisms to make sure it's robust and meaningful that are different than the 125 clock hour requirement. I don't know for certain that will change. It's a very, it's not a heated conversation. It's a very meaningful conversation that's happening right now with a lot of stakeholders. Most stakeholders have the very same goal in mind, which is robust, meaningful professional development, as opposed to checking off boxes or sitting in trainings that aren't useful. The best way to put that in place is yet to be determined. So we will keep people posted. We have brought in several members of our continuing education committees from various districts throughout the state to help us think through what's possible here. And we'll keep them in the conversation so that we're not, for example, overloading continuing education committees with capacity issues. Want to make sure what comes is doable for them. But the 125 may change. It may look different, and we'll keep you posted as we go. The statute does still have a drop-down menu, a list of things that must be covered for renewal for 3 and 4, and those include growth and best practice, cultural competency training, English language learners, PBIS training, positive behavioral intervention systems training, reading preparation, mental illness training, and suicide prevention. So there'll still be a drop-down. You need to make sure to hit all of those, but how the rest of the body of work is defined or shaped or reported is yet to be decided. We'll keep you posted. Substitute licenses, there's a list here in your PowerPoint about what substitute licenses there will be. The only major change to the substitute licensing system to be aware of is that folks who are retired teachers who are collecting a pension, collecting their TRA, and who are working under substitute licenses will no longer have to do ongoing professional development to renew licenses. There was a feeling on the part of many legislators that these folks have been in the classroom long enough. They don't need to continue to collect these hours or whatever the new relicensure system will look like. So that has changed. Much of the substitute system will look very familiar to folks. And the details are here in the PowerPoint. So I'm going to keep going. I'm going to move on then to changes in governance. And again, as I said from the very beginning, we are leaving behind the Board of Teaching. It's in existence through December 31st of 2017. It was formed in 1973 by the legislature, so it's been here for 44 years as the governing body over the profession of teaching in the state of Minnesota. They have been the body charged with determining what teacher credentials should be. They have been the body that has determined, that has had to write a teacher code of ethics. They have been the body that oversees teacher discipline cases. They set licensure rules. That's also the body that has approved teacher preparation programs and continues to do so. So if Winona State, for example, or St. Mary's wants to develop a new undergraduate or graduate teaching preparation program in, let's say, EBD, they present that program to the Board of Teaching for approval, and then they, on an ongoing basis, have to continue to seek ongoing approval in order to run their program. And that's something that happens at the Board of Teaching. And the Board of Teaching also is the entity which handles special permissions. So if there's a rule in place about a particular license or a credential and a district believes it needs an exception to that rule, it has to apply to the Board of Teaching for those exceptions. So that's what the Board of Teaching has done. On the other hand, at the Minnesota Department of Education in their licensing division, those are the folks who have issued and renewed licenses for 44 years. Those are the folks who have made licensing determinations. Those are the folks who say, okay, here's what the rules are. You do or don't meet the qualifications for this license. Those are the folks also who have administered the STAR report, which is the system by which every year MDEs, licensing folks, look at all of the teaching assignments in Minnesota and all of the teaching licenses in Minnesota and make sure they match up. And so if you've got a teacher assigned to teach middle school math but is licensed to teach high school social studies, the STAR report will catch that discrepancy, and the district has a certain amount of time to fix that problem, either to get that person special permissions, appropriate permissions, or license to teach in that assignment area, or to change the assignment. So that's a fairly massive undertaking that happens every year, and that has happened at MDE in the licensing division. And And then they also have issued, MDE has also been the entity charged with issuing every other year, on odd-numbered years, the Teacher Supply and Demand Report, which is a really critical document that provides some of the most fundamental data that stakeholders need in order to look at what's happening in public education in our charter schools. So, as I said, the Office of the Legislative Auditor that recommended getting rid of having two bodies handling different parts of the licensing system and moving it all into one, came up with this. It's going to be this new PELSBA, the Professional Educator Licensing and Standards Board. That's going to be the entity that does all of this. So there will no longer be an MDE licensing division. There will no longer be a board of teaching. There will be one place to go for all of our licensing questions. They will both make up the rules insofar as statute allows them and apply those rules. They will handle discipline cases, code of ethics. They will have to write and establish the code of ethics. They will be in charge of approving teacher preparation programs. They will handle special permissions. They will need to develop the Teacher Supply and Demand Report. They will need to do the compliance work that's involved in the current STAR report, and they will make licensing determinations. So it'll all be under the new PELSBA. This next slide will show you how that new board is comprised, and this is determined by statute. The board will always have to have on it a charter school teacher, a metro area teacher, a greater Minnesota teacher, a related service teacher, and a special education teacher, a teacher preparation teacher, faculty member. So it's a faculty member from a teacher preparation program, but there is a requirement that that person have had K-12 experience. A superintendent, an HR director, a co-op administrator, a principal, and a public member. So that's the 11-member body that will be the new PELSBA. And they have been named by Governor Dayton, and so we just got the list of those appointments. They don't go into effect, they don't take office until January 1 of 2018. So that's the new governing structure. So you'll stop hearing about the BOT, and you'll stop hearing about MDE's licensing division, because those won't be extant bodies anymore, and you'll start to hear a lot about this funny acronym called PELSBA, which will do it all. And from then on out, all questions about licensing will go to the same entity. Education Minnesota has adopted some principles regarding tiered licensure, and I've included them here for you. Education Minnesota believes every student should have a teacher who completed rigorous subject matter and pedagogical training. It's a fundamental principle of Education Minnesota. And these were adopted by our governing board. Education Minnesota will help all classroom teachers receive what they need to grow into the best educators they can be for their students. Our principle number 3 is Tier 4 is the highest state standard for teachers. Education Minnesota will encourage and support in policy and in practice Tier 1, 2, and 3 teachers moving toward Tier 4. Principle number 4, Education Minnesota will promote transparency about the licensure status of a district's teachers and about the resources necessary for those teachers to be successful in the classroom and to move to Tier 4. And finally, Education Minnesota will advocate through the political and electoral process for universally high standards in teaching and in teaching licensure. So those are EM's principles on licensure. As we end, just a few things about resources for you. If you don't have access, please get in touch with your field staff or your local president and ask for, if you'd like these infographics that lay out what the 4 tiers look like. If those would be helpful for you, your field staff can get them for you. We also have several trainings around tiered licensure, and so if you have an IO meeting, if you have a drive-in, if you have a large local and would like to request a training, it's in our professional development booklet, just like all of our regular PD, and you can request a couple things. One of the trainings is a tiered licensure update, which is this is a version of that training, only we'd come out and do it in person. Another is you can do, there's a professional development training that you can request if your group is, if you've got a group that needs it, around tiered licensure and negotiations and contract language, specifically ULA issues. And so if you've got negotiators who need help incorporating tiered licensure into their thinking about contracts, we have a training specifically developed for them. So please feel free to contact field staff with more questions about trainings. And I hope you're all having a wonderful year. Again, my name is Sara Ford at Education Minnesota, and if you've got questions about licensing, feel free to contact me, and your field staff can help you get to me. And have a great day.